So I want to introduce Natalie Pompilio. She's a freelance journalist based here in Philadelphia. She was a former reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and she continues to write for them as well as the Washington Post, the Associated Press, among many others. She's collaborated on 4 Philadelphia-centric books, and the most recent one is what she's going to talk to us about tonight. This Used to Be Philadelphia. And it's a collection of 80 plus city locales and their origin stories. Her book is available, she was just telling us, readily available. It's at the Betsy Ross House, the Constitution Center. But if you aren't getting into the city or want a copy sent to you, I'm going to put in the chat her email address, and that way you can avoid shipping costs. So without any further ado, as usual, save your questions, put them in the chat, and we'll get them when she's finished. Okay?
All right. Thank you. Let me get up my screen sharing option. This is an intimidating group to speak to because if I make a mistake, you guys will all know it immediately. But that's okay because I hope you'll tell me, and then I could fix things. All right, let me share this with you. Is that going?
Yep. Yep.
All right. So, welcome. This Used to Be Philadelphia. It's a collaboration between me and my sister. It's our second time doing a book together. The first one we did was Walking Philadelphia, but we'll get to that. First, she's sorry she can't be here, but she's a mom of 3 and they all have crazy dance schedules, especially on Wednesdays. So quick background. Neither of us grew up here. We grew up in Central Jersey. If you must ask, it is Turnpike exit 10 if you're heading north and exit 14 if you're heading south. Trisha moved to Philadelphia in 2000 when her husband started Thomas Jefferson Medical School. I was here for 2 years in the 1990s and then left and then came back in 2002 to take a job at the Philadelphia Inquirer. She and I both live in Queen Village, about 6 blocks from each other. So our first collaboration, like I mentioned, was Walking Philadelphia. The full name of which I always forget. I think I've finally gotten it now 4 years later. And it's published in 2017. We're about to do a second edition. It got really good reviews, except for one. This is Lucille, who pulled down our Amazon ranking because she needed a magnifying glass to read. But Lucille, if you're out there, your cries have been heard. That's Walking Philadelphia on one side with Love Park. Look how much darker the print is in This Used to Be Philadelphia. Okay, back to our first book. Like, it got some good reviews. We got some good press. And I truly hope that when people say that any press is good press, that it's true, because we also got this article with the most unfortunately placed headline ever. It was something Tricia and I grew up in different towns, and this is the town that she went to high school in. Like, the people know her there. And after this paper came out, my dad called and he's like, "Your sister's going to kill you. He's just going to kill you."
Hey, Natalie, just a real quick request. Could you go to full screen, like presentation mode?
Sure.
So for Lucille and the rest of us.
Lucille, yes.
So it's down below. the little icon that shows the screen right at the bottom of the screen. I can see it just to the right there. You can go into presentation mode. There you go.
All right, let me see that. And okay, so all I have to do is push the buttons. All right.
Yep.
Sorry about that. Okay, so how did this book come about? In April of last year, which seems like a lifetime ago, a publishing company called Reedy Press reached out to me and asked if I'd be interested in writing another book about Philadelphia. So Reedy specializes in city books, and they have different series. And, you know, it was the beginning of the pandemic, but I was already starting to see all my freelance jobs dry up. And I decided, you know, what could it hurt? It'll be good. It'll be fun. We had so much fun doing Walking Philadelphia. Let's do this. I agreed to take on the project. So we're one of 4 in the Used to Be series. And there's many other Philadelphia options you can see there. And then the Jersey Shore one, but it's basically, you know, Philadelphia for us. Interesting, the Unique Eats and Eateries series has 15 titles. 100 Things to Do in Insert Place Name has 100 titles. And besides Boston and Los Angeles and big cities, they have some unexpected places like Traverse City, Michigan, and our own Newark, New Jersey. So read local, friends. So how did we choose the locations featured in this Used to Be Philadelphia? Well, we focused on places that we knew, that we'd walked by, that we'd wondered about, and then ones that friends recommended, a little outside the usual grid that we exist in. Since we were limited to 85 places, we had to leave out some really, really fabulous ones. Even since I turned in this manuscript in September, I'm so mad because I have so many places I want to put in. For example, if I get a chance to do a second edition, I'd like to include the 23rd Street Armory, which this day is the official home of the 1st Troop Philadelphia City Cavalry, the oldest continuously operated mounted military unit in the country. Organized in 1774, it was the first organized effort to fight the British. Members of the troop served as George Washington's personal bodyguards. The first armory, their roof collapsed. It was nearby, but there was a bad snowstorm. This armory was built in 1901. So today, the unit is part of the Pennsylvania National Guard. It's an all-male ground combat unit. When it was founded, the troop's members were part of the city's elite. Today's members share a desire to serve and a respect for history. They donate their National Guard stipends for upkeep of the armory. The horses that were once stabled here are now in Collegeville, PA, but the building has a museum and storage for the 1st Troop. So items that you can see there include the original 1774 battle flag, the original uniforms, which were designed by the Marquis de Lafayette, and a photo of 1st Troop member Pete Conrad, the 3rd man to walk on the moon. So contemporary Philadelphians like myself probably know this space because it's basically a castle-like structure near Trader Joe's. Also, it's the site of many events. So I've been to the punk rock flea market here. The Philadelphia Furniture Show is regularly here. Fringe festival performances. It hosts weddings, any other event you'd have. And recently it hosted the Philadelphia Youth Basketball Program's summer camp. So the Armory hopefully is in book 2. Another place I'd like to get into book 2 is the Arlen Specter U.S. Squash Center. So this is another building with military roots that deserves some attention. This is the former 32nd Street Armory in West Philadelphia. It's on the campus of Drexel. Massive trapezoidal structure was built in 1916 for National Guard training. When Senator Arlen Specter died in 2012, his family spearheaded a $27 million project to transform the space into the first national center for the squash playing community. It is scheduled to host the 2021 US Open Squash Championships in October. And as everyone here will appreciate, once you start learning about one thing, you just have to learn about something else. So as I was putting this together, I found a New Yorker article from, I think it was from 2006, and it talked about Specter as a squash player. And it said, Specter, quote, still bears the scars of his, yeah, it was 2006. Still bears the scars of his years as a bruiser on the squash court. Senator Robert Packwood once gave him a swat that took 6 stitches to close. He plays the same old school hardball version of the game as the Capitol's other celebrated septuagenarian squash enthusiast, Donald Rumsfeld, but the two men have never met on the court. Very, interesting. Had no idea Arlen Specter was a big squash person. And then I said, Robert Packwood, didn't that end badly for him? So then I went down that rabbit hole, which, yeah, it did end badly for him, but it was bad behavior. So basically, I did this in the book too. I'd fall down these holes, and then I take all that information I spent an hour gathering, and it would be like a sentence. But it was crazy, but it's a good. How did I research this? It was hard because everything was closed in those first few months. The libraries, museums, reference desks. But I was lucky. I had tons of information that I couldn't fit into Walking Philadelphia. 2, because Walking Philadelphia, I own multi-Philadelphia centric books. 3, tons of websites dedicated to the city. And 4, the world is digitalized. I could read National Registry of Historic Places applications from the 1970s that had been scanned and placed online. My newspaper background also led me to rely heavily on newspapers.com, which gave me some great nuggets of information. But even with those limited resources, there were some crazy moments. Another example is when I was putting this presentation together, one of the websites I saw said something about MIT researchers putting sound to spider webs and making music. And then one day we could talk to spiders. And it just kind of freaked me out for the whole day because I don't want to know what the spiders would have to say back to us. So basically, it's all about Charlotte there. All right, now we're actually going to talk about the book. We're starting in North Philadelphia. This is the former home of actor Edwin Forrest, who was involved in one of the most extreme cases of fan obsession that I've ever heard of. So Forrest made his stage debut in 1820 at age 14 at the Walnut Street Theater. Some say he was the country's first native-born star, the so-called Brad Pitt of his time. This, despite the fact that some people who have seen his statue at the Walnut Street Theater have mistakenly thought it depicted Nick Offerman, AKA Ron Swanson of Parks and Rec. I'm not even joking. There's a long Reddit thread all about this. Before Forrest, the Brits dominated the American stage, particularly this guy, William Macready. Both Forrest and Macready thought themselves the world's premier interpreter of Shakespeare, and their fans lined up behind them. Macready's American fans were generally wealthy Anglophiles. Forrest's fans were new immigrants in the working class. So 1849, New York, Macready's performing Macbeth at the Astor Place Opera House. Coincidentally, but not really coincidentally, Forrest was doing the same show at another theater a few blocks away. So Forrest fans go to one of Macready's shows and did what one does when one doesn't like an actor on stage. They threw rotten eggs, potatoes, lemons, apples, shoes, anything they had. They also yelled things like, quote, "Take down the codfish aristocracy," which I am pretty sure was a really sick burn in the 1840s. A few days later, with tensions rising, 10,000 people, fans of both actors, gathered outside the Astor Place Opera House while Macready was on stage. Of course, they started fighting. City officials called in the local militia, who just opened fire, killing some of the people there at point blank range. And when it was over, at least 22 people were dead and dozens more injured. Almost all of those who died were Forrest fans. There are stories of women walking around the streets the next day trying to find their dead loved ones. So Astor Place Opera House stumbled along for another year, but they couldn't shake the Massacre Opera House or the Disaster Place nickname, and it was shuttered. Now, from what I've determined, Macready left the US after that and never came back. He never performed here again. He took his final bow in London in 1851. But Forrest continued to act almost until the end of his life in 1872. A few years after the disaster at Astor Place, he purchased this corner home on North Broad Street. He lived there until his death, and then a few years later, it became the home of the Philadelphia School of Design for Women, which in the first half of the 20th century was the largest art school for women in the United States. It is now part of Moore College of Art. This building, since 1968, has been a theater. First, it was Freedom Theater, a performance venue that offers theatrical training to young Black actors. And since the 1990s, it's been called the New Freedom Theater. And among the many alum that you might know, there is Leslie Odom Jr., the East Oak Lane kid, who the world knows as the original Aaron Burr in the musical Hamilton. Back to Forrest. In 1927, the Schubert family honored Edwin Forrest by naming their new theater after him. Now, let's go west. You may recognize this place. This is Clark Park. That's the Dickens statue and Little Nell right there. So we know this park as a community hub. I mean, we've all been to the farmers market, the fairs, the theater performances, the music. It's a community place. What you may not know is that during the Civil War, this was the Union Army's largest hospital. It's originally called West Philadelphia General Hospital. It later was named Satterley Hospital. Tens of thousands of soldiers from both sides of the conflict were treated at Satterley between 1862 and 1865. It's unclear what the exact number of treated patients it is, with some publications saying 10,000, others saying as high as 50,000. Why have your largest union hospital here? Well, it made sense. Then, as now, Philadelphia was a medical hub, home to the nation's first hospital, first medical school, first pharmacy. Even today, it's estimated that 1 out of every 6 practicing physicians in the US trained in Philadelphia at some point. Putting the hospital in West Philadelphia made sense too. The area at the time was quite rural. Army officials hoped fresh country air would speed soldiers' recoveries. The nearby Schuylkill River provided not only a water source, but also a transportation outlet. Steamboats carrying wounded soldiers would dock at 42nd Street, and the injured would continue to Satterley via creek raft, horse-drawn carriage, or cart. The hospital had 4,500 patients in either its main building or one of the hundreds of tents that surrounded it. It was a city unto itself. It had its own barber shop, post office, library, even its own newspaper. At its peak, the population at Satterley in 1 year consumed 800,000 pounds of bread, 16,000 pounds of butter, and 334,000 gallons of milk. This is Dr. Isaac Israel Hayes, a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, and he oversaw the entire facility. Among his policies, every case involving the possible removal of a limb had to be reported to him. He would then consult with, quote, not less than 3 surgeons, unquote, to determine if the extreme measure was necessary. And this is interesting for quite a few reasons. One being that I think many of us associate the Civil War with amputations, which they often seem to do in emergency situations on the battlefield. But what also is interesting is that the term phantom limb pain was coined at another Philadelphia Civil War hospital. This one, there's a historic market for it, really not far from my house. It was officially called Turner's Lane Hospital, but most people called it Stump Hospital because it focused in the care of amputees. So Dr. Hayes and the other doctors had the support of Daughters of Charity Order. The care at Satterley was exceptional. While, like I said, the reports of how many patients were treated overall varies, every source consistently says only about 300 patients in that facility died from their battle wounds. One patient later wrote that the nuns, quote, are different from anyone else or from other people, for they never get sick and they do for us what no other person would do. They are not afraid of the fever, smallpox, or anything else, unquote. And the grande dame of the order, Sister Mary Gonzaga Grace, she oversaw all the nuns and was often singled out for special praise. Years after the war, veterans remembered her as, quote, a ministering angel, unquote, saying no matter what the creed, her devotion was ever the same. She was one of the purest and loveliest of women. When Sister Mary Gonzaga Grace died in 1898 at age 85, Rhode Island Congressman Ambrose Kennedy read the following into the congressional record. In her demise, there passed out of this life a woman of boundless charity, whose ministrations among thousands of Union and Confederate soldiers contributed a note of beauty to the many harassing details of the war. The hospital's patient population rose by the hundreds after the Second Battle of Bull Run and by the thousands after the Battle of Gettysburg. Perhaps that's why West Philadelphia community members in 1915 chose to memorialize the hospital with a rock from Devil's Den in Gettysburg. It's near the south side of Baltimore Avenue between 43rd and 44th Street, kind of under greenery. It's not very obvious. And as you can see, it's not very easy to read. This inscription is, "The stone from the battlefield of Gettysburg is placed by the citizens of the neighborhood in the year 1915 to mark the nearby site of the West Philadelphia General Hospital of the United States Army, later designated the Satterley General Hospital in honor of Brigadier General Richard Smith Satterley." And it goes on from there. So this rock and a historic marker on Baltimore Avenue are the only indications that this hospital was here. Now we're going to go to South Philadelphia to talk about the MOYAMENSING prison. You may never have heard of it because today I call it the Acme Supermarket near my house. It's roughly 10th and Reed Streets. If you shop there, we probably cross paths. So the word MOYAMENSING comes from a Lenni Lenape word that's been translated to either one, place of pigeon droppings, or two, place of judgment. I don't know which the prison was named after, but I'd like to make a guess. Alternatively, the prison was known as the 11th Street Dock, the Jug, the County Hotel. When it opened in 1835, some observers said it looked like a Gothic castle. One historian wrote, it looked like it had been built for the ages. The ages came to an end in 1963. MOYAMENSING had 490 cells in the main building, each about 13 by 9 with 9-foot ceilings. Now, despite its very intimidating appearance, apparently escaping from MOYAMENSING wasn't as difficult as it should be. A 1959 Inquirer article tallied 15 escapes in 25 years, which seems like a lot to me. That year, 3 inmates busted a hole in their cell's ceiling, then used a bed sheet to repel the prison's 40-foot wall. The men left a message on the wall of their cell. It said, "The food isn't fit for pigs. Also, inmates are locked in their dungeons for 21 hours a day. We all hope you tear this joint down tomorrow. Then maybe we'll come back." Of course, they were all recaptured, and it's unknown if the food ever improved. So most of these inmates were short-timers, among them Edgar Allan Poe and Al Capone. So Poe slept off a drunken bender here in 1849, which really might not be that special because he seemed to be arrested and slept off drunken benders in many different cities and jails. But Capone bunked overnight here in 1929. He was arrested outside a city movie theater for carrying a concealed, unlicensed .38 caliber revolver. After one night MOYAMENSING, he was transferred a few miles north to Eastern State Penitentiary, where he served a 7-month stint in a cell decorated with expensive furniture, lush rugs, fine art, and a perfect radio that he used to play waltzes. As a side, Capone was incarcerated during a particularly bloody time in the Chicago Mafia Wars, and people accused him of hiding out in Philadelphia. He denied that claim until his death. Another notable inmate, a little more noble, was lawyer and abolitionist Passmore Williamson. He spent about 100 days here for his role in helping free and then hide Jane Johnson and her 2 sons. I'm going to detour briefly to talk about the rescue of Jane Johnson and her family. It happened in 1855, got lots of national attention, and then increased tensions for the upcoming Civil War. So, 1855, slavery is illegal in Pennsylvania. A North Carolina politician named John Wheeler was leaving for Nicaragua, where he would serve as US ambassador. Although he knew Pennsylvania did not have slavery, nor did obviously Philadelphia, he chose to leave from the port of Philadelphia to go to New York, to eventually then go to Nicaragua. He was bringing with him 3 individuals he considered his property: Jane Johnson and her 2 sons, Daniel 6 and Isaiah 10. She had a 3rd son that had been sold to a slaveholder in Virginia that she never saw again. So Wheeler and his entourage get to Philadelphia that July. He goes out to dinner. Story goes that Jane took that chance to tell a restaurant worker that she and her children were slaves and that they did not want to go to Central America. That message reached William Still, a Black man born to free parents in New Jersey. He was a member of the Anti-Slavery Society and led a team that directly helped those seeking freedom. He calls his friend Passmore Williamson, the only white member of his team, and both run to the waterfront because they have 30 minutes before the boat's going to leave. So the 2 men and 5 Black dock workers find Wheeler and his party already on board. Passmore Williamson attempts to talk to Jane Johnson as onlookers shout that these men should just leave Wheeler alone and not rob a man of his property. But Passmore persisted, telling Johnson she was entitled to her freedom, and he extended a hand to her. She took it. That's when Wheeler got a little angry. He pushed Passmore. 2 of the dock workers picked up the 2 boys and ran off the ship. Williamson and Johnson followed, with Wheeler in pursuit. When the group jumped into a carriage and fled, Wheeler asked a nearby police officer for help. The man allegedly replied, "I'm not a slave catcher." A few days later, Wheeler and Williamson faced off in court. The pro-slavery judge, a friend of Wheeler's, demanded that Williamson reveal the location of Jane Johnson and her boys. He would not, and was thus jailed for contempt of court. Wheeler maintained that Passmore Williamson had kidnapped Jane and her children. Even the judge said that Williamson was the only person involved in the incident who deserved punishment because of all the parties to the act of violence. He was the only white man, the only citizen, the only individual having recognized political rights, the only person whose social training could certainly interpret either his own duties or the rights of others under the Constitution of the land. Williamson's incarceration made national headlines, but not to worry. By all accounts, his stint behind bars was as pleasant as it could be. He had more than 500 visitors, including Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. he was able to furnish his cell, quote unquote, most comfortably. Lucretia Mott would comment that Williamson's imprisonment was extremely helpful to the abolitionist movement. In fact, she said, Williams's father was, quote, only afraid Passmore will come out of prison too soon, unquote. Williamson was released from prison in November. One newspaper reported that he left, quote, with a triumph and a fame which but few men in the great mad battle for freedom could claim, unquote. But before we continue with the Moyamensing prison story, I wanted to note something about Jane Johnson and the active role she took in her fight for freedom. When Passmore was still in jail, she returned to the city despite the fact that there was a federal warrant for her arrest under the fugitive slave law. She wanted to testify that it was her choice to leave Wheeler. She said, quote, nobody forced me away. Nobody pulled me. Nobody led me. I went away of my own free will. I would rather die than go back, unquote. When she left the court that day, it was unknown if there'd be riots outside. The US Marshal was on hand with a posse of officers. People thought he may arrest her. In preparation for that, city police officers lined the path between the courthouse and the carriage she would leave in, so she would have safe passage. Fortunately, the marshal and his men did not move. Jane and her family eventually settled in Boston, and Isaiah later served in the US colored troops during the Civil War. A historic marker near the Delaware River and Walnut Street tells a part of that story. So if you remember, we were talking about Moyamensing Prison in South Philly, and then I got into a 10-slide detour about Jane Johnson because one of the men who aided her escape had been in prison there. Sorry, everything's connected. Let's go back to Moyamensing. Not all of the prison's inmates were as noble as Passmore Williamson. One of the most notorious was H.H. Holmes, considered America's first serial killer. Holmes' story is well documented in Eric Larson's 2003 nonfiction book, Devil in the White City. It tells Holmes' story against the backdrop of the 1893 World's Fair. For those unfamiliar with the tale, Holmes took advantage of the crowds drawn to Chicago for the World's Fair by advertising rooms for rent in his World's Fair hotel. And I'm not even trying to be funny and make Roach Motel, Hotel California jokes when I say guests who checked in never checked out. Holmes's hotel was actually a confusing maze of Holmes's own design with dead ends and confusing hallways. Holmes killed the builders who worked on it so they couldn't reveal his secrets. Holmes wanted this so he could torture and kill at his home pace. This came to be known as the Murder Castle. Holmes' victims included men, women, and children. He used multiple methods to slay, starving some, suffocating others, giving others a dose of chloroform. But finally, he was arrested in Philadelphia in 1894 and sent to Moyamensing, which is where he was executed by hanging 2 years later. Before that, he released a confession that was published in the Philadelphia Inquirer. He called himself a degenerate and admitted to killing 27 people. But some historians believe the number of victims may actually be in the hundreds. That said, Holmes also died protesting his innocence, as this headline attests, and I'm not sure how that innocence protestation goes with the 27 people I killed Confession, but it's all in history now. The MOYAMENSING was torn down in 1967. The Acme came in about a decade later. Now, another example of how everything's connected. When I was putting this presentation together, I learned that in 2018, Britain's Channel 4 released a television documentary called Meet the Markles. In it, Holmes's great-great-grandson says Meghan Markle is a relative of his and therefore H.H. Holmes. That said, a spokesman for the BBC promised that the show was humorous and warm in tone. I think the moral of the story, at least for me, is do not mess with the British press, particularly the tabloids. They do not play around. So now you've been to my grocery store. I'm going to take you to my pharmacy. This is Rite Aid on South 9th Street, just north of Christian Street. In the 1880s, Italian immigrant Antonio Palumbo opened the boarding house here for Italian workers. Many of these men landed in the US at the Washington Avenue immigration station. And if you haven't been out to Washington Green since it's been redone into a park, well worth it. Between 1873 and 1915, more than 1 million European immigrants came to the US through the Washington Avenue immigration station. According to legend, some Italian men, many from the Abruzzi region, arrived knowing no English, but with a slip of paper pinned to their shirts that read, Palumbo, 8th and Catherine. And when they got there, they found inexpensive food and lodging. Soon, other Italian immigrants moved to the area and opened businesses, thus giving us the so-called Italian market, also known as the South 9th Street Curb Market that we still have today, the largest outdoor continuous market in the US. Antonio's grandson, Frank, took over the family business, and he turned that boarding house into an entertainment complex, purchasing adjacent properties to use as banquet halls and bars. By the 1950s, Palumbo's took up a whole city block. The club drew some of the biggest performers of the era to its stages, including Louis Prima, Jimmy Durante, Louis Armstrong, and Bob Hope. Palumbo, as one Philadelphia Inquirer article noted, held sway nightly among his innumerable friends. He was generous with his friendships and is credited with furthering the careers of singer Frankie Avalon, Joey Bishop, and politician Tom Follietta, among others. Palumbo was also a close friend of Frank Sinatra, even serving as best man when Sinatra married Ava Gardner. Palumbo convinced his famous pal to sponsor a youth football team in the so-called local midget league, which later became Pop Warner. In 1948, Palumbo's Clickets beat Sinatra's New York Cyclones in the first Santa Claus Bowl, an event promoting the growing league. As an aside, some say Sinatra was eager to take part in this event to get some good press because he'd been photographed in Cuba with known mobsters. Also, Sinatra's team was advertised as undefeated, but that was only because the team was newly formed and had never played a game. Palumbo's was a gathering space for local families and civic organizations, hosting countless baptisms, bar mitzvahs, the annual banquet for the all-Black Old Philadelphia Club. A 1949 article in Life magazine focused on a single day in June when Palumbo's hosted 31 weddings. Now, Frank Palumbo never ran for office, but his clubs were very popular with politicians because they were considered neutral territory. Because of the complex maze of corridors connecting all the buildings in this block area, some politicians would hold fundraisers in multiple ballrooms, then sneak around so they can make an appearance in each one, putting in minimal effort for maximum money. One New York Times article noted that it is possible for a politician to win an election without holding a fundraiser or a reception at one of Palumbo's 3 banquet halls, as some have proven. But few seeking citywide office, and fewer still who depend on South Philadelphia votes, seem willing to take the chance. Some say Palumbo had mafia ties. In 1962, an FBI wiretap caught a conversation between mob boss Angela Bruno and another man, in which it was implied that Palumbo's had a safe or sterile phone booth. Actor, singer Mario Lanza, who was born and raised only blocks from Palumbo's, was so angry at these implications. He called Palumbo one of the city's unsung heroes for his philanthropic undertakings. He did things like sent orphans to the circus. He funded city youth programs. Palumbo himself said, "If I stop giving, I stop living." He also paid for about a dozen of the Philadelphia Zoo's animals, the first being an aardvark in 1950. And the picture is allegedly Palumbo feeding an aardvark, but it looks so weird to me that I then had to look up an aardvark, and I'm not really sure who that is. But let's just say his first animal was an aardvark. He also paid for the zoo to get an African fox in 1978, and he named it Tom after an Inquirer columnist. Then I found a 1984 interview with Palumbo's daughter. Her name was Franca. She said the zoo once named a hippo after her, and she was not very happy about that. She was happy, however, when a llama donated to the zoo in her father's honor was giving her name. In 1994, Palumbo severely damaged by a 4-alarm fire. This generation of the Palumbo family said the building didn't have insurance. They were leaving the family business. And now we have our Rite Aid. And that's all I have for you this evening.